Welcome, everyone. We're going to launch in now. I'm Matt Segall, for those who don't know me, chair of the Science Advisory Committee for the Cobb Institute. Let me first thank the Institute, especially Richard, who's in the background driving the Zoom session here. Today, we have a special guest, Àlex Gómez-Marín, who is a Spanish physicist turned neuroscientist. He has a PhD in theoretical physics, but now works at the Institute of Neuroscience in Alicante, Spain, where he's an associate professor. He runs a research lab there, the Behavior of Organisms lab, and is also just recently, he's become the director of the Perry Centre, which some of you may know was started by David Bohm, and David Pete ran it for a while, and it looks at areas of interest to the Cobb Institute. So check out the Perry Center if you're not familiar with it. Today we're talking about scopaesthesia, or extended sight, and its relationship potentially to process philosophy, to the philosophy of organism. Àlex, great to have you. We've had some conversations behind the scenes over the last months about some of this, and I'm really excited to be in dialogue with you today. So welcome. Those of you who were around for the seminar sessions we did on Tim Eastman's book may remember Àlex. He wasn't able to join us live, as I recall, but had a recording for us getting into some of the neuroscientific details of Tim Eastman's logoi framework. So Àlex is not new to the Institute, but today we're talking about something very different. Àlex, to help those who have no idea what scopaesthesia is or extended sight is, can you just introduce this topic to us and share a bit about the type of research that you're doing on it?
Yes, great. Thank you so much, Matt. And let me just preface this by saying that I'll consider this like we're having a conversation, the two of us, and nobody's watching. But the beautiful thing is that we can maybe have this private conversation, or at least attempt to flow as if it was a private conversation, knowing that there's more people in the room, and then invite them all in. So to talk about scopaesthesia, maybe let me step back 2 or 3 or 4 steps so that perhaps we understand why I'm interested in this phenomenon. And so I'm a physicist, as Matthew said, who by chance transitioned to neuroscience, and I started learning about neuroscience and also getting to know how things are done there, the language used, the questions asked, the assumptions held, and so on. And so my neuroscience started pretty orthodox. I was in a fly lab. We were studying sensory processing in Drosophila. But then these questions started evolving into more heterodox questions, if you wish. So instead of adopting maybe the input-output view of the brain and information processing, I started to get interested in more cybernetic approaches. And this led me, to make a long story short, into, and you may be familiar with this, into the extended mind folks, right? So this crowd of thinkers in the neuroscience and the mind sciences, for whom, of course, the mind is more than the brain, and the stress there is the constitutive role of the body and the true interaction with the environment, and so on. Now, so this is heterodox in a way, but still falls within the acceptable. Now, I started questioning myself. Yes, an extended mind, but what do we really mean when we say the mind is extended, right? Is it a metaphor? Should we take it literally? Should we take it in another sense? What do I mean by that? Well, when we're looking at something outside our head, right? An image, a coffee cup, as academics always put as an example, which betrays the fact that we hardly ever go to the forest. It's always the coffee cup. It's not a bird or a baby. In any case, when we see something outside, and we say our mind is extended, what do we really mean? Do we mean, again, that our minds are there too, in a way? Or do we mean that, sure, it's very important to understand the dynamic relationships and so on, but at the end of the day, there's a movie going on inside my head, or if you want, inside my skin, right? So then I realized, and it's maybe a loving critique of this crowd, which I admire and still study. I started to realize that sometimes when we speak about the embodied mind or embodied cognition, well, when you press it towards science, so what difference does it make? Can we think of an experiment that would tease the more orthodox versus the more heterodox view on the mind? Then my feeling is that people then move towards saying, well, no, we're kind of doing interpretation. It's more kind of a philosophical approach into cognition. Okay, that's fine. But then if it's a philosophical approach, then how would it help us understand phenomena that lay outside the edges? And so slowly and slowly, I became a heretic in my questioning of what the embodied mind really means. And that was at a time when I met Rupert Sheldrake, with whom I have conversations regularly. And of course, he started telling me about scopaesthesia, which I'll define in a moment and I'll explain. And so I started to get more interest in those sort of experimental approaches, and also looking at the other side for what theoretical frameworks can help us frame again or understand those experiences. So here, if I was using slides, which I won't, there should be a slide which is a comic where there is some scientist presenting some data, and it says, look, it works in practice. And then comes kind of an angry man like this and says, but does it work in theory? Right? So here we have this double. So what I'm going to present today is more problems than solution. Is this double problem? On the one hand, there are phenomena that look weird, that debunkers or skeptics, I would call them pseudo skeptics, and we can talk about this later, would say, well, they're totally impossible. Why even bother? You're doing, and then they start using language, to just discredit. This is just, again, supernatural stuff. Of course, it's nonsense. This is pseudoscience. They use all these prefaces, to discredit the word. This is even paranormal or parapsychology. For some people, is an insult. So on the one hand, there's no patience to entertain those phenomena and see what they're telling us. But then on the other hand, what theories do we have? And when I say theories, I'll move from the three M's: metaphors, models, and metaphysics, right? So that's really why I want to be in conversation with Matt and the process philosophers, because I think Whitehead's cosmology, but also in particular his theories of perception and also of causation, may provide this bed where we can, or this ground, let's put it this way, this ground where we can see if these experimental flowers can grow before, people step on them saying, it's not possible in theory, and of course it's not possible in practice. Now, the extended mind, I'm a Bergsonian, so I came to the extended mind through Bergson, and most of my theoretical support for trying to understand what's going on is his book Matter and Memory, which is 126-year-old. It's amazing because I think it's still cutting-edge neuroscience in a way. And there we could talk about memory, and I'm not going to talk about memory today, but with Rupert and other people, we're working on memory, both from a theoretical and also from an experimental point of view in the neurosciences. And there's of course perception. So I'm going to talk about perception. Now, again, for Bergson and for Whitehead and so on is, well, perception is not a representation of things out there. And Bergson has these really pioneering and beautiful, could say even definitions of what perception is as virtual action, which is in a way the ultimate grandfather of the extended mind ideas I was talking to you at the beginning, and so on. And so within perception, to ground it, I was searching for experimental phenomena that could be used to, again, not make this a pure speculative exercise. And I am saying this with all my love because I really like, speculative exercises, and I read philosophy. I'm a theoretical physicist myself, but it's like is there something we can go and test that can make a difference? So in here, we have, I'm going to talk about two phenomena. They're related in the sense that they have to do with perception. One is scopaesthesia, and the other one we could call it extraocular vision. It's also called extended sight, and both are taboo. Let's be clear, right? So Matt, when we were discussing what title to, how to entitle this conversation, maybe the word psi, or again, the word paranormal or parapsychology was hovering around. I refrained from using them, but in a way, this is a coming out of the closet for me, publicly saying, I'm interested in this, I'm working on this, I'm doing experiments on this. And as some people have said, well, doing science should not be about what you study, but about how you're studying it. So bear with me. Now, scopaesthesia. Scopaesthesia is, it has a long history in the sense that it started around the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th, with very few papers. And then Rupert Sheldrake picked it and proposed ways to test it empirically. And what is that? So it's this sense that somebody's looking at you. So it's the ability, the supposed, let me just say, the supposed ability that people have, and maybe animals too, of telling or feeling that somebody is looking at them. So if I was talking to kids, they have no trouble visualizing this. If I'm talking to adults, we have all these prejudices. But let's just caricaturize it by saying having X-rays coming out of the eyes. So totally taboo, right? Because the intramission theory of perception, of vision in particular, is that, of course, information comes from the outside to the inside and is processed, but nothing ever comes out of the eye. Now, if something comes out, that could be one explanation, or in any case, if there's a phenomena by which people can really tell that they're being looked at, how do we know? Well, I mean, you turn around, and then at that precise moment, there's somebody looking at you. Of course, a first explanation will be, well, you feel that too in many other occasions. You turn around, there's nobody looking at you, and you don't recall those experiences, right? So that's and it's a possibility, it needs to be tested, but that could be the easiest way to explain that away, saying, well, sure, you may turn around sometimes, and probably it has happened to all of you, and somebody's looking at you, but it also happens many other times, and therefore there's nothing in it. Now, how to test this in a more scientific way, more controlled way? Well, Rupert Sheldrake devised, again, this very ingenious and very simple experiment where you put pairs of students. In that case, you could do it with adults. One is facing the other sitting backwards, and you hand them a sheet of paper, and there's a randomized sequence of instructions, very simple, as to whether you should look or not look in trial 1, trial 2, trial 3, and so on. And then the other person needs to indicate after every trial whether he or she feels he or she is being looked at. And this has been done. This has been done in schools. And again, there is evidence. Maybe it's not overwhelming, but there's some evidence that the probability of saying you're being looked at and getting it right, or saying you're not and getting it right, is above chance. It's above 50%, but it's a small effect. Maybe it's 56%. And meta-analyses have been done, for instance, I think by Dean Rabin and others, comparing Rupert's experiments and other people's experiments. And again, there seems to be something there, right? At least, and that's interesting. If we were be talking about the gene for whatever, gene X for disease Y, or neural circuit X for behavior Y, the statistical standards to consider that's real wouldn't be, so would be consistent with those that are used to see whether this is real or not, right? So that's with respect to some experimental evidence. Then there are also questionnaires when they ask people, again, formally, has this happened to you? In what conditions, and so on. And it's a large percentage of people that say this has happened to them in the real world. So here are the surveys. We could talk more about them. And then on top of the experiments and the surveys that are done to people, how to put it? So there have been other types of experiments that are slightly different, that have to do more with not an aware statement about whether you're being stared at or not, but through other means, like, for instance, electrodermal conductance and so on, through CCTV camera, which makes it even weirder because, you know, you're not looking at somebody directly. It goes through a television circuit and so on. And there's also evidence there that the phenomena could be going on. Now, in my conversations with Rupert, I felt like, you know, I could be discussing about this, and that's great, but maybe I should also see it myself. So I designed some experiments and I run them here in Alicante with kids. Students come every year in the thousands to this Brain Awareness Week, and we're asked to entertain them with, you know, science fairs and so on. And I do. And I propose them, we're going to do an experiment that's also an experience. And for a whole week, I was doing this, you know, with many, many kids, as many as maybe 800, right? So it's a large data set. And later we can talk about also the challenges, because this is not like putting rats in a maze where, you know, it's like, okay, one press. This is a problem that also more orthodox neuroscience and cognitive science has, which is that you're working with organisms, but with organisms that are humans. And so there are all these confounds, right? What you had for breakfast, whether you're impressed because you're in a neuroscience institute, we're all different, we have different talents. Let me use this example of, you know, I have two little daughters, and let's suppose you're trying to test for a skill, for an ability, because I think scopaesthesia and also extraocular vision, which I'll introduce in a moment, are skills we have. Well, if you put a baby or a little kid on a bike or in a swimming pool, well, they'll fall or drown, right? So it needs to be there, and some people are more skilled than others, and also needs to be worked out. Now, you can test hundreds of people and ask them to do something, and even if that's a natural ability, it may manifest very clearly on some, others, you know, it won't be their best days, and others maybe have it really atrophied. So that's one of the challenges that we found. But nevertheless, I analyzed the data, and there were good and bad news, and all of that I'm telling you is in a way and literally unpublished, and it's preliminary, but we're working more on it. So overall, it was a chance, but there were two schools, and one in particular, in a particular session in the morning, whose stats were way above, not 56, but maybe a bit more. And it was very clear that in the test there was something going on in it. So on the one hand, you could say, well, let me pull everything together and say there's nothing and just abandon the study of the phenomena, or let's see what happens with this small group. This small group was a particular school, and so I learned that this school, and this is just a comment, maybe correlational information, but it's from an area that's quite, how to put it, depressed economically and also socioculturally, which makes it interesting, because if you have the bias or the prejudice that these things can or cannot work, well, that also may depend on your social background and what you think and your parents think is possible and not. So in any case, I went to that school. I asked them if I could go. I repeated the tests, and well, it was a lovely experience also, because they were really surprised that I came back, as if they mattered, actually. And one of them said, I'm going to really do it very well. And when I asked, what do you mean and why? I said, well, professor. Well, professor, you came back, so it means, you know, you take it seriously, so I will take it seriously too. So in any case, we repeated the experiments, and the performance went even higher, right? So, and even higher means, you know, 66% or so overall probability, 30 kids, not 1,000, but 30 kids, 66% of getting it right, which is far above chance, right? So there's something going on in there. I was in the room with them. You could say they all conspired so that they designed some method to maybe to tap their feet and cheat. I don't think that was going on. But in any case, and some of them, it really got 18, 19, 20 out of 20. By the way, when I was doing these experiments with the large groups, and this is again anecdotal evidence, but it must be mentioned, a young woman came right after the experiment, and he asked me, so what's the usual score people get in this? So remember, it's 20 trials. And I said, well, I may know, but in a way, I'm just doing it to know, but a little bit above chance. So if I say 55%, so let's say out of 20, average, you may get 11, 12. That's why it's, a small but significant phenomenon depending on the stats. So she said, well, so I did 18. And I'm like, oh, very good. And then she wanted to tell me, well, because when I have my eyes closed, I can see the eyes of the other person and I can see whether they're open and closed. It's like, I see it. And I asked her, well, so did you know that or you just figured it out? I said, no. I know this perfectly. She was quite shy, actually. I know this perfectly, and I just wanted to tell you, and I just wanted to know, to know how good people perform on this. And, I nearly got them all because I literally could see it. Of course, I couldn't chase her because that's not allowed. I had, of course, written all my experimental procedures and so on. So I couldn't even know who she was. And so she left and I never knew back from her. But that really stuck with me. Again, what are the odds that a kid wants to fool me? But, one of the biggest maxims of science is not to fool yourself. So in any case, these guys, when I studied them in their school, which by the way, it's important because it's not the Neuroscience Institute room, it's the place where they're more at home, they perform even better and some perform incredibly well. So now then we design other tests to do this in a radio room, because I have some good friends who are neuroscientists and I share with them that I'm doing these things. They say, hey, Àlex, why are you doing this? I mean, you're losing your mind. Come on, don't waste your time. And I said, no, please, stress me on that. Let's see. Of course, so one hypothesis could be, well, even if it's not just pure chance and people make it up, it could be that there's some cues, of course, because at the end of the day, what are we talking about? We're talking about extrasensory perception. Is there any kind of information transmitted here that doesn't go through the five senses? And again, that's anathema, right? You cannot even pose it as a scientific hypothesis. But so, well, in order to rule this out, well, to rule out chemical cues, sound cues, and visual cues, of course, well, kids were usually blindfolded, like they were blindfolded in all the experiments, but we went to a radio room. They were blindfolded on their backs turned. Of course, no sound there, no smell. And we tested this time with a smaller group. And the results went down again, which is not, which is something you will never read in a paper like this kind of roller coaster of things working and not working. It's hardly ever told this way, but I'll tell you. Results went down, but then I asked them to do it in groups. I asked them a few of them look at one particular person, and then the results went up again above chance. Now, some people may be smiling, especially those that are debunkers. So yes, so more X-rays flowing out of the eyes just reinforce this effect. Well, who knows? It's also true that again, there's something called in psychology, it's called performance anxiety, right? So again, you're testing for, one could make this joke. It's like, imagine we're testing about erectile function. I mean, that's something you could say in Europe. I don't know if that would be allowed in the US to make this example, but let's say we're testing out erectile function and we make this, I'll stop in a room and we say, okay, everybody, just take off your clothes and show us what you can do. Okay, out of 20, how many do you think they can do it? Very few. Does this mean that skill is not there? No, it means context really matters, right? So this joke is to illustrate seriously that it's really hard to study this phenomena. And maybe I would leave it like this for scopaesthesia and briefly mention the other phenomena I'm studying, which is even weirder. This is called extraocular vision. It's been in the literature scattered. I've traced its history and I've studied it. There's a really beautiful book called Eyeless Sight by Jules Romain, a Frenchman, in the 1920s. And he studied this very carefully. And I was amazed when I was reading through it and got to the end. In a footnote, he mentions he had invited Henri Bergson to watch these demonstrations. And I'll tell you what these demonstrations are in a moment. And Bergson couldn't make it, but then he could, and then he went. And then he, in a way, certified what happened. But the deal was that, in a way, you couldn't tell what Bergson thought about it. But the writer makes it sound as, him and other main figures of the time. And this is how it was done then. It wasn't like you publish it in a journal. It was more like you invite a famous philosophers and thinkers to your place and you show it. And in a way they testify that they saw it and so on. So in any case, there's this book, Eyeless Sight from 1920s. What's this ability? It's the ability where you blindfold an adult or a kid and they can see with your eyes blindfolded. Again, Alex, what are you doing? Are you wasting your time? This is total nonsense. Well, I came through it. I knew about that through the work of Jacobo Grinberg, who was a Mexican neurophysiologist who disappeared in 1994. The story of his life is amazing, and there's a documentary recently that talks about it. But he has all these theories about consciousness. By the way, theories that were written before the official orthodox kickoff of consciousness studies, by Crick and Koch. There was life before the 1990s in the scientific study of consciousness. And there were people with really sophisticated theories about how perception and comes about, and also doing really crazy experiments. And Jacobo Grinberg was one of them. By the way, he did this experiment, the EPR, Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen version, for two interacting brains with EEG, separated, isolated in Faraday cages. It's beautiful that the Nobel Prize has been awarded this year for entanglement. So spooky action at a distance is not so spooky, or if it's spooky, it's pretty real. And maybe it's also real for minds. Now, Jacobo had studied all sorts of phenomena, Jacobo Grinberg, and he described these experiences he had with kids in a school where he could and others teach the kids with the eyes blindfolded to see what's in front of them. So this story is from the 80s. I told you about the 20s. Now, I think it was in the 60s, there were a series of articles in America, in the United States, about some Russian women who could do it. And these were other times. They could discuss, how is it going on? Some people have the theory, it's called, so another name it's known, it's dermo-optical. They still think there could be some light sensitive receptors in our skin, because those people, those women in particular, could guess the colors, right? But some could read, which is pretty remarkable. Now, I'm studying Jacobo from a theoretical point of view, and then I type extraocular vision in Google one early morning when I work, and I realized there's people here in Spain teaching kids to do that. And again, it's like, okay, one more of these scams, right? Because you do a training, so parents pay, and you also train the trainers, But I say, okay, let's see. And then I realized there's something going on very close to where I live. So I'll say, well, maybe I could just go and look, right? So I asked whether I could go, and there was a meeting of these families, actually, not just one kid, but a family, a set of families who have been paying to have their kids trained on this. And let me just say, it's not that these parents want their kids to be psychics or anything like that. It's that the whole, and this will take more time to explain, but just to mention because it's important, the whole meditative, if you want, practice of getting the kids to, again, supposedly be able to do that involves, working on their awareness, so they improve at school, they're more calm, it's good for them and their families. So in a sense, parents who go who come across these sessions and pay for them, they're doing it because of you could say, the side effects of opening these doors of perception, right? It's not like they go then and they're showing their kids to do these things. It's a means to an end. Now, for me as a scientist, it was impossible, and that's an important word here. It's impossible. It was impossible experimentally and maybe also theoretically, and that's the process philosophy way of thinking. Let's see if it can be less impossible through that perspective. But empirically, I wanted to see those kids, so I went and I saw how they did it, and fair enough, blindfolded, and they could. The kids that have been trained more, not the beginners, although it's pretty fast for kids, not so much for adults, they could see colors, they could do puzzles, of course, not by the shape. They could draw and then pass the drawing around, and the other person would continue drawing exactly where the house was. And they could read. So I will give him a text, and they could, with the eyes, like the Russian lady, right? They could read. Now, we all know James Randi and the magician debunkers, and I have very good magician friends, professional ones. Actually, one of the research areas I do in the lab is to use magic as a tool to study cognitive processes. Most of them, especially today, they'll say, well, there are 1,000 ways you can fool somebody by pretending you're blindfolded. You move your head like this. There's this it's not even a theory. It's like the control where there's a little opening here, because you can never really, make sure there's, well, you can make sure there's zero light going in, but if you use normal blindfolds, so they can be a light opening here. And so Randy and others debunked this in a way. Now, these kids are using 3 layers of blindfolding, right? And also sometimes they're able to see what's inside a box. And that was one of the drawings in this 1920 book by Jules Romain. So the technology of the time was blindfolding a chair and then putting a hand in a box and being able to tell, what letters are being written there and so on. Now, I saw that they were doing it. And again, they could be conspiring to cheat me or fooling themselves. Now, I asked whether, if they had another meeting, I could see them again. And in a way, and this is even harder in terms of experiments, it has to be playful and they get tired very quickly. So it's not something like, okay, just let's bring 100 kids and for an hour, let's just present them with things and do statistics. It's another kind of science in terms of the method. And that's perhaps interesting for the discussion too, that I feel needs to be put in its place. But I had the opportunity to see a few of them again, and in a way start to study them by simply, the parents would ask them to do things. And let me just mention one case, one example of something they did, which is very remarkable. So they were doing this puzzle, which they had to find. So there's a puzzle with some animals, and they have this species which is the same animal, and it's a game for 2 years old or 3 years old. Just put the butterfly on top of the butterfly, the ladybug on top of the ladybug, and so on. And they were doing it with the eyes blindfolded, no problem, right? I also wear the blindfolders. I also looked like this to see. But in any case, okay, they could still be looking at it. So I turned the pieces upside down and I shuffled them while they had their eyes blindfolded, like in domino. And I asked them, okay, can you now do the same thing without just turning the pieces upside down? And they would take them and maybe they would feel them underneath, maybe not. And they would start putting them, and the puzzle was done perfectly in front of my eyes, right? Again, I don't think this is coincidence, but many more things need to be studied. And in that 1920 book, there are a lot of experiments that speak about how this ability may overlap with the laws of vision. It's very interesting. And also many scientific tests that were done, but not published. They just explain in that book about the importance of different colors, the intensity of light, directionality, also testing what parts, if it has to do with the skin, what parts of the human body may be more or less sensitive. And just to add here, not to make it longer, that I'm in contact with some trainers that are testing these abilities in kids, and we're going to study them more carefully. So to wrap it up, and I really wasn't expecting to be that long because I wanted the discussion. Again, it seems to work in practice, and I am working on it, and we'll do more tests on it. But what really happens, and this has happened to Rupert Sheldrake over and over, is like these skeptics, they don't care about the evidence because it is simply impossible. So you point them to papers, you point them to the stats, you say, come and do it, come and look at it. It's like, no, it's a waste of time. Why? Because I know it cannot happen. So why would I bother? But what if it happens? So at the same time that we're working on the experiments, I'm working on the theory. And this is also something very psychological. If you, even in our efforts to just, demolish materialism, you need to put something in its place, right? So it's really good, not only if you can come with experiments that would show that the paradigm, doesn't hold, but you need to have something prepared, because otherwise people it's like, no, I'm not going to jump from this boat, even if it's sinking, if I don't have another boat there. So that's really where I think process philosophy could help us understand, what's going on with perception. I mean, non-local perception, how literally can we take it? What experiments we could even do that are more ingenious than the obvious things that need to be done. And so this is a plea for not philosophy of science, but in a way, philosophy for science. How can, again, philosophy, and I'm not naive to say, it needs to be, I'm not saying Whitehead's cosmology needs to be cast into a scientific hypothesis or else forget about it. No, not at all. But wouldn't it be nice if we could just let it soak down and propose some experiments that then we could test, and that would be a really nice positive feedback between hardcore philosophy and hardcore experimental neuroscience. So I'll leave it here. Sorry, I was much longer than I expected. I really hope we can have a dialogue.
No, that's quite all right, Alex. I think it was important to lay out the history of attempts to study these phenomena scientifically, and to give us a sense for how you're approaching it. I really think there's something to this this idea, as you frame it with your comic you were having us imagine. It works in practice, but does it work in theory? Until we have an alternative to materialism, it's very hard to for skeptics to make sense of this sort of phenomenon. Even though, as you were mentioning, there are so many surveys where they ask people, have you ever felt like you were being stared at and then turned around and saw someone staring at you? Or do you believe that this sort of thing happens? And it's something like 90% of the public believes that there's something to this. And then in the research that you've been doing and that others have done, there's just enough statistical significance to require an explanation, right? Mm-hmm. And then this other issue of, as J.B. Ryan was well aware, an early psychical researcher, there are certain individuals who seem especially good at some of these non-ordinary capacities, whether it's being able to see blindfolded or being able to feel others looking at you. But the problem is, one way of describing the problem is that, we really don't see with our eyes, we see with our concepts, which is to say, unless we have some interpretive model to make sense of what we're seeing, we don't even know what to look for. And so this data that confounds the representationalist understanding of cognition and consciousness has no place. It's anomalous. There's no place for it to fit. Luckily, Whitehead does provide us with the one possible alternative to the representationalist approach, which, again, just to reiterate, it's the understanding of consciousness and cognition as representational, you could say, goes back to Descartes. There's this movie playing on the inside, as you said, Alex, or a Cartesian theater, I think is Daniel Dennett's phrase for it, where everything that we're conscious of, our whole lives really, are a sophisticated hallucination produced inside the skull by neurophysiological activity. Whitehead kind of makes fun of this view in Science in the Modern World. He says, some people express themselves as though bodies, brains, and nerves were the only real things in an entirely imaginary world. You shared a paper with me that's under review right now, where one cognitive scientist discusses how, from the representationalist point of view, the blue sky overhead, is actually smaller than our head because it's inside of our skull, right? According to the representational theory. So we need a new theory in order to see these anomalous phenomena that you're describing. So we can get into the process philosophical understanding of consciousness and cognition, but I want to just stay with the experimental, the investigations that you're doing for a second here. You say you're coming out saying that you're interested in this more publicly now, and you've already encountered some skepticism from your colleagues. Is that the biggest obstacle initially? The skepticism of other scientists, neuroscientists, that in a sense won't even take the data seriously, much less get to the next point of talking about what new sort of metaphysics might be necessary? How much resistance are you meeting so far?
I'm not meeting a lot of resistance yet. but in a way I can anticipate it because I see what happens and what has happened to people who have just entertained the possibility, not even to promulgate their own theory or insist this is absolutely real, no questions, just to entertain. So it hasn't happened yet, and in a way, there's a saying in Spain where we say you're not going to put what's the name? What you put on top of a wound, you're not going to put a tissue,
Bandage. Yeah.
a bandage on the wound before you have the wound. So I'm not doing this, but also I need not to be stupid, in a way strategic, and see how do I explain those things, because I really believe they have a place in academia, right? I really believe they have a place in especially in neuroscience, where we're technologically so empowered, but conceptually so weak, and where people do tons of sophisticated experiments, but really never really wanted to go to the edges. In a way, that's what Feynman has this quote, says we should attempt to prove ourselves wrong, and to do so as fast as possible, right? So I have the feeling we don't want to prove ourselves wrong, and if we do, it's like, okay, let's do it as low as we can. So this non-local perception or non-local memory that I was talking about, which is to me taking the extended mind seriously, not just in the discussion of the paper where we say, well, no, to take it seriously, these are like acupuncture points, as Rupert says, that can, produce these breakthroughs. So we're tired of writing grants and papers where we say, cutting edge. Well, no, it's not at the edge, groundbreaking. No ground is being broken. It's just more of the same, right? So you're asking, there's a sociological aspect that you're mentioning, and it's very important. Maybe that's the reason why, for instance, the society, the Medical and Scientific Network just put out a book called Spiritual Awakenings, where people tell their anomalous experiences in a way to normalize it so that we can talk about it. Much like the gay revolution, right? Like if we cannot even talk about this, now when we talk about it, we'll see what we do about it. So in a way, yes, there's a work to be done, which is sociological, but there's a very important work to be done, which we must not forget. It's not just about coming out on the street and saying, anomalous experiences also count, which is, how do we even study those phenomena? Because I feel I have the intuition, and I sense it while doing it, that, for instance, the experimental effects are huge. Like I really felt that the results were fluctuating depending on how much I believed that thing to be happening in those, trials I was testing in the kids, right? So maybe the scientific method itself needs to be, transformed so that we can study those phenomena.
Well, so often in psychology, and attempting to study things in the lab, difficulties arise because human beings in our natural habitat, so to speak, there's so many complex factors involved, and reproducing everything in a lab, eliminating confounding factors that you're not trying to study, it can become very difficult, and it's especially the case when you're dealing with something so anomalous, because, for example, scopaesthesia on the one hand, which is the sense of being stared at, and extraocular vision on the other hand, being able to see blindfolded, there seems to be they're related in the sense that if certain people can see blindfolded, that implies, well, maybe there's not something raying out of the eyes. You don't need that to see. Whereas scopaesthesia, the initial explanation one would leap to is that there is something raying out, and others are feeling it on their back of their head or whatnot. So there's a way in which we have to coordinate these two abnormal phenomena, abnormal in a scientific sense, I should say. Many people among the general public, as we said, think that these sorts of things are possible. So is there a hypothesis that you've developed in regard to how to coordinate, say, these two phenomena you talked about, extraocular vision and scopaesthesia, which would be consistent across the two phenomena? In other words, like, it seems that just the idea of the eyes raying something out to touch what they're looking at, so to speak, would be consistent with scopaesthesia, but not with extraocular vision. So have you thought about how to coordinate these two phenomena?
Yeah, this is a very good question. In a way, I haven't, but I can tell you how I would. I haven't because, at least for me, because I've been studying this very recently, and using this metaphor of like the growing flower, right? These are kind of tiny flowers growing. So in a way, I haven't yet wondered how they relate to each other, or play upon them big stress tests. And by the way, this is a footnote, but this is also important. Sometimes when there's a phenomenon that somebody reports, which is nascent in the idea, okay, it seems we're looking at this, the more skeptical people come to do what we say scientists are supposed to do, which is knock over, hypotheses. But it's like, wait, I mean, it is a baby, you knock down adult theories, you knock down adult, experiments if you want, but let's treat this with a bit more care. And I'm not saying this as an excuse not to properly study it. Now, how to put them together? Maybe we can go to William James, 1898. You'll know this better than I, Matt. The essay on immortality, where he presents this. He says, sure, the brain has a function in all of that, but what kind of function? Is it productive or is it permissive, right? So this is the highest level umbrella for me to conceive this. I think both phenomena are pointing to the idea that the brain is permissive, not productive of perception, right? But then you still need to provide more concrete ideas as to what this filter is doing and how it is doing it, right? So that's why I'm studying, Jacobo Grinberg's theory, and that's what I'm reading Whitehead in a way. But so the idea will be that also in Bergson, like these images, in Matter and Memory, he speaks about the world not being made of stuff nor ideas, and he says, well, there are these images there, and they all relate to each other. And perception is the virtual action one image would have on another, and there's a very special image, which is that of my body, which in a way doesn't change or change more slowly. So if that's your starting point, then you can conceive, and that's the important thing. It's not impossible anymore. You could start to conceive that the things out there are other images, but in a way that I'm going to use a Whitehead term that doesn't fit, but in a way that I'm internally related to them. So the question is not really how I'm, with my eyes blindfolded, how I'm able to kind of figure out some information of that thing that's sending me. It's like, no, I'm already in contact with it. And probably what's happening is that in our default way of functioning in the world, driving and so on, which is don't use those faculties. But because it's like, it would be like Borges wrote as well, it would make our lives really impossible, or practical lives impossible. But what if through some training, some special people, you mentioned talented people, but this is also very natural. Kids can do this apparently very natural. And also the work of Rupert Sheldrake, he looks for these mysteries of everyday life. So to make the anomalous less anomalous, it's very normal, like, pets that know where their owners are coming home, you don't need to be a super talented pet or a super talented person for this phenomena to manifest. So they're more normal than we tend to think. So in a way, that's replying to your question. That's how they both fit, but they're different because one is social, and there's also, sense of being started. There's a role of the person feeling what's going on. And to the students, and also I've done it with adults, after the experiment, I asked them to write down in a very general way what they felt or how they felt it. It's very interesting. I with the kids, I was doing it every time at the end. Okay, tell me, what did you feel? Did you feel anything at all? I wasn't trying to bias their questions. And these school groups were coming, 3 or 4 times every morning. So I had many instances of that from different places in the area. And the 3rd or 4th time, I could already see some patterns there. So some people were talking about heat or something, some tickling here at the back. Others described something that was heavy, not very comfortable, but most was something here. So at least for the phenomenology, it could be suggestion, okay, but that will also give you some ideas of what to test next, in what part of the body, for instance, may be more sensitive. So that's for the sense of being started, which is more social. extraocular vision, if you want to call it like that, well, it has to do with one person just making sense of the world around them. But also when they read, I'll tell you something that's puzzling. When they read, and they can read, like, I've seen it, they can read, and they're not looking. It's not like there's some blue sneaking in through a little pinhole here. They're fucking reading, right? Now, if you put something in front of them, for some time they cannot read. So that makes the thing. So I'm not saying this is magic. I'm not saying there's something not just non-local, non-material at all, that they're accessing it through some super quantum consciousness. No, I don't want to invoke these vague concepts. This is another point that's important. Seems to be, it has to come down to material stuff. The brain, of course, is involved. They're also able to tell me how they, also about the phenomenology of these kids. I ask them, how do you see with your eyes blindfolded? And they tell me how they perceive the world. And in order to tell me that, the brain is involved. So in a way, we're not talking about something that's non-material. It has to go through matter at the same time. But we're caught in this Cartesian dualism. And it's either the old story that classic neuroscience tells us, or some sort of supernatural thing going on. I think it's neither of both. It's something where both are honored, but that goes beyond what we can imagine at this point. So that's why, again, we need theories that help us even conceive what could be going on.
Right. So you brought in William James, and so I think this is a good segue into some of the more metaphysical questions. James, like Bergson, and like Whitehead, who in some ways was taking James's psychology and trying to expand it into a cosmology, they are offering us an alternative to the idea that the world is just inside the head. I was recently reading Ian McGilchrist's new book, a mutual friend of ours. I'm interviewing him tomorrow, actually. And he draws out these distinctions from James, 3 different interpretations of the mind-brain relationship, right? You mentioned the permissive understanding, which I think is the closest to what Whitehead would want to say. But there's the emission theory, the transmission theory, and then the permission theory. The emission theory would be the idea that the brain is emitting consciousness, excreting consciousness, let's say, as a kind of epiphenomenon that's limited to what information can come through the senses and be processed in the brain, right? This is kind of, for folks like us, maybe a seemingly self-contradictory theory, because it requires a bifurcation of nature, right? Where you say that some of the information is objective, like the things that physics and science generally can measure and weigh and so on. Those are the primary characteristics, whereas the qualities that we add to our experience, like colors and scents and so on, or secondary characteristics or psychic additions, in Whitehead's terms, that are locked inside the head, right? So this would be the emission theory, where the brain is the sole cause of our experience of the world. The transmission theory is more like the brain is a kind of radio receiver, and there's a field, a mind field, if you want, that we tune into, but the transmission theory on its own seems to imply that the brain is sort of passively receiving this field. Now, the permission theory is inclusive, I would say, of the transmission theory, but it gives the organism, the embodied brain and nervous system, more of a creative role as a constraint or filter on mind at large, let's say. And this seems to be closest to what our favorite philosophers, Bergson, James, Whitehead, are trying to articulate. Whitehead, when he dwells on the concept of perception, he will talk about how the 5 senses, especially vision, actually present us a very abstract, highly refined mode of access to the outside world, to the world around us, and that really the primary mode of perception is what he calls bodily reception or causal efficacy, right? Where we're just bathed in these feeling vectors streaming in from the world around us. And in some sense, the five senses evolved to tune in to a specific narrow channel amidst this welter of feeling that's constantly being absorbed by our organism, but mostly, almost entirely, especially for human beings, all of that's unconscious. But nonetheless, when you walk into a room, you don't even hear anything yet, you don't see anything yet, but you know there's anger in this room, right? And then you start to construct what's going on as you observe things more conventionally with your eyes and ears and hear the words that are being said. But for Whitehead, there's a way in which he even discusses this idea that the many ancient philosophers held, that we perceive with our internal organs, that there's like the liver perceives anger, and like the other organs are not just processing fluids in the body, but actually have a perceptual capacity of some kind or another. And that we, with our conscious minds, are so in a way disembodied and detached from all of this, that we've lost the ability to perceive in a way that, puts us more directly in touch, right, with the world around us. And so something like extraocular vision or scopaesthesia starts to make more sense when you welcome in this deeper form of perception, which again Whitehead called causal efficacy, whereas the five senses Whitehead would locate more in this mode of perception he calls presentational immediacy, which again is very abstract relative to this concrete flow of like feeling vectors that we get through causal efficacy. So just with this framework, I think we already begin to see possible windows into explaining the type of phenomena you've described for us, Àlex, not as parapsychological or as psi or paranormal or something, but as actually quite normal, but so normal that we don't even notice that it's happening.
Yes, and I'd like to hear more about those distinctions, right, that you just made, because I think they're theoretically very juicy. Just to add on this, sure, one part of the explanation can certainly be, let's remember we live in a body, like we are a body, right? And that would be a more explanation more in the lines of, for instance, Antonio Damasio and other, celebrities of neuroscience, where, we need to insist, and that's, by the way, where the extended mind people with the 4Es and so on do a great job, right? Let's insist that it's not just gonna be some trivially and obvious aware processing through vision, let's say, but we can sense literally the world around. It's our body that is sensing the world around, right? But these two phenomena in particular, I think they're pushing this even further. It's like Damasio plus, because it's not just the body. Again, I like them, and I'm spending time, investigating them, and in a way risking the little reputation I may have at this stage. I'm studying them because they really go beyond. It is not, and it could be, by the way, it could be that when we test further this phenomena, well, maybe, for instance, let me tell you one hypothesis that would be very, in a way, materialistic, that could be possible, and it would be great. And we all know that our heart, as it's beating, it's creating electromagnetic fields, right? And some people can measure that. What if the other person is sensing something literally about the electromagnetic field of the heart of the other person? They can tune to it. Great. In the same way that, that you can tune get into a room, and maybe you can literally smell the anger because there's some pheromones produced. And that's why you open the door and right? That could be a very five-sense explanation of what's going on, or five senses plus, proprio and interoception, like the whole body. Very well, we can test that. But it seems that there's something more going on there, because in some cases, again, it's really hard to, Occam's razor, it's a joke if you're trying to think like the simplest explanation. It doesn't even make sense to postulate that they are maybe moving their knee and that's being transferred through minor vibration in the ground, and that's how they pick it up. Well, you can certainly do experiments to rule these things out, but it seems to be more than that. Now, as for explanations, and for instance, Rupert and I like to invoke the notion of fields, which is tricky, but it's also to provide some history of science itself. Like, fields have been proposed explicitly or implicitly to account for phenomena that we cannot see, or we cannot see directly. We see the consequences of them, and a really good conceptual tool to conceive of them is, well, they're extended in space through fields, right? So, of course, Rupert's morphic fields are one example, and they're taboo because they don't subsume to the sanctioned fields in science so far. So fields could be a way to even start thinking about it. Another idea that I want to share with you and throw at you is maybe this distinction between the virtual and the actual that Bergson makes, and of course Whitehead too. Maybe some of these phenomena are still real, but they're not actual. Maybe they're lay more in the virtual realm, and so maybe the rules, the laws, the habits of nature that govern them are not like the ones we study in physics textbooks. And I know that Stuart Kauffman and Dean Radin have proposed something similar along those lines. And if you think about quantum mechanics, and again, I'm not invoking a quantum explanation of this, but it's just as an example in physics where the actual and the virtual are playing a very interesting game. And that creates many counterintuitive situations, many paradoxes. And as Ian McGilchrist says himself in one of his chapters, right, the chapter on paradox, paradox is not something in a way to solve or to run away from. It's something that is showing you there is kind of a greater truth to be integrate those apparent opposing ideas, right? Or this apparent impossibility can be transcended. So in a way, that's what it's very exciting from a scientific point of view, and also I think from a philosophical point of view, that it can be this challenge where it calls for an integration of phenomena that that go beyond what we know. It's the adventure of ideas. Let's go beyond what we know.
Totally. And I'm glad you brought in the virtual actual distinction, which in Whitehead becomes the potential actual distinction. And there's different forms of this that Bergson definitely wanted to avoid, where actualization is just taking an idea that was existing in potential and sort of infusing it with blood, and there's nothing really creative going on. And I've tried to read Whitehead as not succumbing to that simplistic understanding of the relationship between the two. And but the role that potentials play, certainly this is a helpful interpretation of quantum phenomena, that there's a sort of field of potential, that measurement collapses into something actual, and that our universe is not just a collection of already actualized things. It's a movement, a kind of rhythm into and out of potentiality and actuality. And so when we think of various psi phenomena, I think there's a role for this field of potentials to play. And in fact, when Whitehead mentions positively telepathy once in his book Process and Reality, it's in a discussion of statistical probability and our capacity to make statistical inferences. But he says, but there's also a form of non-statistical probability where we can make inferences. This would be something like what Peirce calls abduction, which has to do with for Whitehead, our connection to the primordial nature of God, which is his way of describing this graded realm of possibilities or potentials, that in each moment of our experience, through our connection to this initial aim, this preference for some possibilities over others provided by his conception of the divine, each organism is able to make a decision about what to actualize in the next moment that would be most relevant and most beautiful in some ways. And he says that telepathy might be an example of our capacity to tap into this field of graded possibilities. And there's a non-local dimension to this, such that, you know, my capacity, we're all tapping into the same field of potentials, right? This same gradient of possible feelings that we can actualize in the next moment. And so with that kind of a framework in place, we can see how, you know, when I feel someone staring at me, maybe we're participating in the same gradient of possibilities, and it can be kind of ephemeral, and sometimes we don't both actualize the same possibilities, but nonetheless we're near to one another in our non-local perception of this field, right? And we can cultivate perhaps the skill to become clearer in our perception of these possibilities. And so this is one window that's open that Whitehead thought made room for telepathy, which in Process and Reality, he acknowledges, hey, there's empirical evidence for this. If we're going to do cosmology honestly, we need to find a place for this in our scheme. So he tried.
Yes, honestly, yes, let's do it honestly. Let's not try to save the appearances too quickly, right? And I like you mentioned a window open, because, you know, there are the doors of perception, but many of these doors are sealed philosophically, perhaps, and scientifically, but if there's some good windows open, maybe we can sneak in. And yes, at that time, like 100 years ago, it was pretty normal, or maybe at least it wasn't again taboo to talk about those things. And there was this whole movement, William James himself, and they would visit seances and so on. You may say, well, nothing really came out of this, so they were wasting their time, even if they were like great thinkers and writers. But 100 years ago, there was no problem in entertaining this phenomena. Something has changed. But at the same time, you see, Rod Hensel pointed me to Sri Aurobindo's Life Divine. And for all these really like great yogis, the real deal, no, not just mindfulness on Tuesday and Wednesday from 6 to 7, like the real deal. They don't call it psychic. This, if I recall correctly, it's the subliminal. They have this, and also in Indian thought, right? Like this very sophisticated electrophoresis even of the mind, not like here in the West, perhaps. Well, that's a subliminal going on, and it's you know, it's no big deal. It's totally normal, and it's not even about them. So I'm saying this because it's not even about, ooh, you know, we can do those things, and if only we could just, you know, grasp on them, you know, we could be doing amazing things. Like for the yogis, it's just a train station in the long road to what they're trying to achieve, right? So from this perspective, it's not anomalous and it's not normal. It's just one more side effect of the whole process. I'm glad to hear that for some philosophers, this can be addressed honestly. Again, I think for science, it's a very interesting stress test to see really if scientists preach with their example, right? Maybe that's more sociological point again, but you know, all this saying about the unknown and just, you know, not being attached to one's ideas and so on. Well, let's prove it. Let's study those phenomena. You mentioned this non-statistical, I don't know if you said probability, but I recall also Bergson in his address, isn't it, to the Society for Psychical Research when he's when he becomes the president, he speaks about this dream. You know, you could have a dream of, let me make it up, of you're there and there's this lady wearing a red scarf, and then this, you know, this thing happens, and then this glass breaks and so on. Now, if the next night or if the next day something exactly like that happens, right? There's no way to study it statistically in the way sciences usually work. I mean, what are we supposed to do? Run 1,000 multiverses and then average out? I mean, that's stupid, right? So that's what I'm saying. Maybe science cannot get there. I'm also willing to accept this possibility, but I'm exploring it in the sense that we're bordering sometimes to phenomena that seem to be very unique or extremely contextual, right? And so this idea of ceteris paribus, or else being equal, and let's just run the experiment again, probably breaks down. But it's at the edge. And speaking about edge, I don't like to call them psychic. To me, these are phenomena at the edges of consciousness. And we could add also dreams and lucid dreaming. We could add near-death experiences. We could add, meditation itself, psychedelics, and maybe the zeitgeist is changing, at least for psychedelics now. It's been sanctioned by universities and, of course, the corporate world to make money. But this weird phenomena of mind, it's coming again from the underground back to the more visible arena of discussion, usually quicker in the for the general, like for the lay people. Now, if the lay people are sufficiently interested, if serious people and are brave enough to say they're also interested in those things, or it has happened to them and they deserve inquiry, then maybe things can change. And if they don't, well, some crazy people will continue studying them, no matter what happens, which is what happens.
Yeah. I'll just make one final reflection here, and then if you're ready, Alex, we'll open it up. I see some questions already showing up in the chat. It seems to me, though, that there could be a limit to what can be scientifically verified, because the scientific method has certain features which, for example, if telepathy, if scopaesthesia and extraocular sight are in some sense involved in or tap into this realm of potentia, as Tim Eastman would call it, or this virtual field, by definition, you can't measure that without collapsing it into the actual, right? And so just because it's not accessible to the third person methods of science, and in some ways is in this subtler realm of our consciousness and experience, doesn't mean it's not real. And so part of the issue here, it's not to say that I don't encourage you and others to do this research, but there's another issue, which is that we expect science to be the judge of everything, and that there might be some things which are beyond science but nonetheless verifiably real, and it's just a matter of what's the final judge. Are we like James and Bergson and Whitehead? Are we radical empiricists in the sense that experience goes beyond just what can be easily measured? Or are we going to be scientistic? Are we going to insist that if it can't be scientifically verified, that it is BS, right? And so that's a larger sort of sociological, cultural issue that I think makes the sort of work you're doing even more difficult than it would otherwise be, just trying to capture something so subtle in a scientific way.
Oh, thank you for saying that. Let me just quickly add two thoughts on this. So, as that famous president, whom I should recall, but I don't, said, well, let's not ask what science can do for...
Kennedy.
Kennedy? Yeah. Let's not ask what science can do for psychical research or for anomalous experiences or for the extended mind. It's more the other way around. Let's ask what they can do for science. So I totally agree with you. And there's this danger of saying, no, this can also be studied scientifically. And then, in a way, I join those views that I oppose by being scientistic, right? And that's one of the reasons why I've been running this conversation series called The Future Scientist, to explore how much science can be expanded. And for instance, Bernard Carr has proposed some theories based on hyperdimensional spaces and so on to expand science. And we're going to be in conversation soon, the two of us. And sure, let's try to expand science, and maybe at some point it breaks. And that's also fine. We realize we could expand it a bit more. I think there's still room for expanding it, but at the same time, at some point, we may get this warning: no further, not beyond this point. And then it's not so much about the future scientist, but maybe about the future human, right? How do we continue this process of inquiry? And that's also something that really strongly resonates inside me. It's like, I'm a scientist, but I'm a human, right? And maybe I'm a scientist because I'm studying this phenomena. But let's put it in a question form. What would I do if I really want to understand those things? And I convince myself that science cannot go further, even though I've expanded it. Maybe I need to become an artist. Maybe I need to become a yogi, right? And so that's like hardcore honesty in the pursuit, because if that tool, which is a tool, it's a fantastic tool called science, can go further, do I stay in the car complaining, or do I just open the door of the car and maybe, use another vehicle to continue what could be called the evolution of the human being, which is something we are shy to say sometimes. Yes. So that's. But thank you for making this point, Matt. It's very important. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Alex. All right. Let's open it up. I see, David, you've already made a comment. I don't know if you want to chime in to follow that up.
Sure. Dr. Gómez-Marín, thank you so much. And you mentioned at one point in your description that the results that you saw with some of the students seemed to almost depend on how much you believed they could occur. And that reminded me of the description of what happened with Jacques Benevisti, and described in Lynn McTaggart's book, The Field. I don't know if you're familiar with that. But he got some very interesting results in his laboratory. They were looking at the effect of certain compounds on some measurable effect on tissue cultures, I think, and his laboratory worker diluted the stuff they were working with to the point of where it really didn't exist in the solution, but yet it still had an effect, and it seemed to be a kind of memory of water. And of course, nobody believed it. But it turned out, so they sent some critical scientists to replicate it, and they could not replicate it. And so it spoke, I think, and McTaggart supported this, that intention was somehow it's almost like the universe was accommodating, what you believed. If you did not believe it, you wouldn't find it. If you did believe it, you could find it. And very interesting description. You might be interested in looking at that in her book. This speaks to some kind of non-local field of influence that's there, and perhaps it's, as Matt says, related to perception in the mode of causal efficacy. I don't know. Could be.
Thank you for these comments, and I didn't know about that, but I've certainly heard about the power of intention and so on. And I must confess myself here, because I want to be as honest as I can, but no more. But I want to be honest that amongst the believers, I feel inclined to be a skeptic, and amongst the skeptical as a believer. So, when I'm discussing with my Orthodox friends, I push them in that direction. But I must also admit that when I hear claims about, yes, just stare at this and it will grow and so on, there's a skeptical mind in me too, right? But in a way, maybe that, who was Leibniz who said something like that, maybe all the things you can say about the universe are true. It's the things we say, we negate about the universe that are probably wrong. So probably there's space to entertain all of that if it's done. Well, I was going to say seriously, but I don't want to fall into scientism. How to express that thought I'm trying to convey is that not anything goes, but at the same time, anything should be looked with rigor, but also some sort of love.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Any future science that takes. Go ahead, David.
reminds me of what Ian McGilchrist said about truth. And he said that truth was a very rich but not completely describable process, and that to find truth required an openness to many possibilities. And yeah, I quite agree. Yes, you can both be you can both be skeptical and a believer at the same time. Yes, indeed.
Right.
And he speaks about half-truths. Very important, these half-truths, right?
Right. And any future science that takes consciousness seriously, not as an epiphenomenon, but as a real feature of the universe, is going to have to grapple with the role of intention in shaping what we observe, right? Yes. That certainly complexifies, the objectifying stance of the scientist and the scientific method as we've inherited it over the last few hundred years. So,
let me add one more piece of wood to this beautiful bonfire, because I feel it's not only intention that matters. I felt there's something, maybe use the word sacred about, not secret, sacred, sorry for my Spanish, sacred about all of that. Why? Because it's much beyond Bacon, in the sense of, it's not even, let's not put nature in the racks, let's not torture nature. It's more that, it's not even, let's have a Goethean conversation with it. It's not even, let's bring intention and belief that the phenomenon can happen. I felt that it's also whether that thing, and this is going to sound very godlike, but that higher mind where everything is running may decide where this happens today or not. What an uncomfortable thought, but I felt that also in these experiments, right? Like, well, Àlex, maybe everything is in place today, but you won't get that grace today. Sorry. Right? And so this is a meta level of what can be going on with this. And I've talked to other people, and the people that's there in the closet, right? And when they explain, when we go beyond these experiments and the obvious controls, I've sensed that too in them, like that there's some will of the scientist, but there's some grace of this phenomenon choosing or wanting to manifest in that way, that time, because you're asking, which makes sense if we think we're in a true conversation with nature, right? Not because you're gonna whisper to her, may she want to reply that day. Let's think about that.
Yeah. Douglas, I see your hand, and then we'll go to Seraphim.
Extending the argument or the approach of both David and then Kirsten just now in the chat, as I recall from Sheldrake, somewhat vaguely, the closer people know each other, the better the results. So if there is actually a personal connection of some sort between the subjects, and I would just wonder in general, how can we study that effect of what actually causes an improvement? Can you do it with meditators, with practitioners of Tai Chi, with anybody who has a religious bent, with process folks, and see what sort of results you get? If you have any thoughts on that.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for these two questions. I see them as two questions which help me maybe clarify and expand on this. So I think I know well Rupert's studies, and when it is important that there's some kinship, it's more for the telepathy kind of experiments, for anticipating somebody's gonna phone you, or like mothers that may feel in their whole body that their baby is in need of food or whatever. And so for that, a social bond, a previous social bond, is really critical. But for scopaesthesia, for the sense of being stared at, that doesn't seem to be the case. And actually, we know it works with strangers, right? We turn around. When we turn around, it's not necessarily our sister or mother or father who's looking at us. It's a stranger. And this helps me introduce one more point that I didn't make, which is, and Rupert excels at that, which is the natural history of this phenomena, and maybe even placing it into an evolutionary context. And here I mean evolution, maybe even in a Darwinian sense, right? We go beyond that. Like like, what if animals have developed this skill? Because it makes sense that if you're a whatever, a spider or a fly, to note that you're being stared at, because probably it means the sense of not being eaten by, not just the sense of being stared at, right? So in the animal kingdom, it would make sense. Still, again, we don't know, and it's really hard to imagine the mechanism. And in humans, it's probably the same thing. It would pay off to be able to be as sensitive. And in particular, that's why I'm saying for scopaesthesia, kinship would not be required. Actually, you would want it to have with people you don't know. That's for the first part. The second part, with respect to practice, exactly. So one strategic way to proceed is find the talented people, you know, like, for instance, in remote vision, they would find those who can do it and just stick with them. Another parallel route is cultivate that in people, because if we believe it's there, it can be cultivated. So we are, for instance, designing mobile apps so that people can play with these things. So to gamify it, to make it fun, and also the advantages it has for reaching more people and so on. I mean, neuroscience now is going beyond the lab into the real world to study orthodox phenomena, where we can also do the same thing and go into the real world and study these things. And of course, we're not the first to think about that, but there's the, so if people find it engaging and it's fun and they practice, can you imagine if they would practice and then we can give them some, probably it's better than doing all the things on the net, just, you know, working on your skills like this, and then the thing could get big, and we could even have, that's an idea Rupert often discusses with me, you know, if this can get big, well, we can have contests, and then it's gonna float above the gates of academia, because if everybody is interested, like Wordle, right? If everybody's playing Wordle, who cares if now celebrity academic says that's not real? We just like playing Wordle. So strategy could be, let's make this available and fun to the people, so that while playing, they get better at it. And if many people get better, enough of them get better, then the phenomenon will have literally jumped out of the statistically significance of laboratory experiments into the real world.
Thank you.
Thanks, Douglas. Go ahead, Seraphim.
So yeah, I just wanted to make a few suggestions for populations that you might do your next experiments on if you haven't already. And some of it was suggested by Douglas. So, you know, people who are meditating together and have brainwave synchronization, but have done it for a long time, like maybe come off a 10-day meditation retreat, so that people have been cultivating this for quite a while, are actually even more in sync. Another one would be people studying in a Kabbalistic circle together, because the study of Kabbalah emphasizes the notion of this entrainment of brains, trying to achieve a oneness. Another one would be a group of Tai Chi players. If the Tai Chi players, you know, have been in sync for a certain period of time, that'd be a great population to study. And here's the most probably controversial, but perhaps interesting, and that would be take a group of people who maybe even they meditate together, but then they're ingesting psilocybin from the same mycological network, because the mushrooms are communicating in the ground already. They've built a network. So this is possibly, you know, kind of a future orientation for when the whole damn electric internet goes down. There'll be groups of people who have already been cultivating alternative networks for brainwave synchronization and alternative means of seeing and perceiving. So that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you for that. Combining, you know, it's like psi research, you know, it's synergies between these edges of consciousness. Again, there are 2 routes, right? One is big numbers, more democratized, if you want. Another one is, let's look for the athletes that would go to the Olympics and test those abilities with them. Yeah, I think both are routes to go.
Let's go with Rod next.
I wanted to raise a question, Matt, that I think you might have a reflection on. And this is the question of intentionality. You know, in earlier days, in the medieval and Hellenistic period, I think there was this philosophical idea that we receive the species of those things that we are perceiving. The ideen, the seeing, is also the idea of the thing itself, or the truth of the thing. It's, you know, in Sanskrit it would be the swabhava, the self of the thing that is somehow entering into our own self, because we have this subtle connection with everything. And this is an idea that was common at various periods in both the West and the East, as you know, especially Hellenistic and Vedic times. So intentionality might be more than just an idea of what we want to do. And, you know, Heidegger has made a lot of this idea. It's a kind of pre-conceptual knowing of where we intend to go forward in time. And as a sort of a minor example of this, I made a note earlier, Àlex, in response to something that you said. And my note was that the extended mind phenomenon may be an indicator of a domain of reality beyond our perception. And you came to this conclusion yourself. And you know, I was happy to see that development in your presentation, and also the idea that that these youth who are practicing extrasensory perception are doing it also for the sake of the well-being of the family and their general performance. And then you concluded your presentation with the idea that we could perhaps cultivate this dimension of our consciousness, as opposed to just trying to find physical explanations of it, and that this could be a direction in evolution. And you know, that conclusion that you reached was something that I could sense in the very beginning of the presentation about the scientific interest. And so it seems to me that there is a kind of intentionality that's coming through your presentation, and the conclusions that you're both reaching by thinking scientifically and thinking philosophically. You come to this idea that is common to yoga, that we have these potentials that can be realized if we devote sufficient time to them. And you know, the recent suggestion that was made about groups of meditators and so on. You know, this is exactly what monks are doing in monasteries. You know, they're elevating their energy of consciousness through practice over long periods of time. And they arrive at understandings of larger dimensions of reality. And this seems to be a hopeful direction in which your science may be tending. Thanks.
Thank you, Rod, for rephrasing it like that. Yes, I also see that coming from you, and you making explicit that seems to be permeating from what we're discussing. It's very valuable to me. I mean, Rod and I have known each other for a long time. I discovered Whitehead and Bergson through Rod in India. I mean, I owe a lot to this man, and you know, listening to you. Actually, by the way, we went to the Seizing an Alternative conference in 2015. Rod and I co-organizing a section on neuroscience and process philosophy, and that's where I met. Well, I didn't talk to you, Matt, but that's what I knew about you. So there's a kind of beautiful closure here in terms of what it all started for.
And that was where I also heard Matt speak about Whitehead in a way that that mirrored Sri Aurobindo. And of course, now Sri Aurobindo is, I know that his thinking permeates to some extent the activities of philosophy at the Institute for Integral Studies. And so for me, it's gratifying that Sri Aurobindo's ideas that germinated at the same time as Bergson's and Whitehead's and Heidegger's, may eventually contribute to a further understanding of what was being generated at that time.
Yes.
He was certainly part of that movement.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for all these comments, Rod. Let me briefly respond, and I see we've got two more hands up. Consciousness evolves, and not just in the Darwinian sense, but at least in Baldwin talked about more than natural selection. There's organism selection, that we are in some sense agents of our own evolution and not just passive sort of survival mechanisms. And in this sense, particularly among human beings, of course, our intentions matter tremendously, and what we are willing to believe in, what we are at least open to believing in, has so much to do with what, in fact, the universe will show us. You spoke about this more participatory form of perception. For example, in Aristotle, when he would perceive, an organism, for him, the idea that would grow in his mind, in his imagination, would be the form that was also active in whatever, the flower or in the beetle, whatever it was he was studying. So there was this sense of deep intimacy. There wasn't this split between mind and matter.
Right.
There was a participatory understanding, and we've gradually lost that and come to imagine ourselves as just isolated atomic individuals, sort of like Leibniz's windowless monads. And my concerns about materialism and scientism and these things is that because consciousness is evolving, because it's malleable, there's a real danger that we actually do become the sorts of beings we imagine ourselves to be. And so, right, the way we talk about ourselves and what we take seriously and not, it's not like the truth is just out there waiting for us to discover. We enact it, right? And so we change ourselves as we begin to imagine ourselves in different ways. And abilities that we may have are atrophying because we don't believe they're there. We don't believe they're possible. One last thing I want to share in this vein, I thought as you were speaking of William Wordsworth's The Prelude, which Wordsworth's so important for Whitehead, some of you may know, and he was talking to Kant, and I think this holds true generally of the skeptical scientific stance, where Wordsworth warns against what he calls the narrow estimates of things, and he says, "Suffice it here to hint that danger cannot but attend upon a function rather proud to be the enemy of falsehood than the friend of truth, to sit in judgment than to feel." In other words, skeptical scientists are so concerned to avoid being wrong, the enemy of falsehood, right, that they're not a friend of truth in the sense that they're open to what's possible. There's more concern about, right, not being wrong or being duped than there is to actually discover and be open to the truth, which may come through feeling and not just rational judgment, right? So just wanted to throw that into the mix. I think that's important here. Alex, are you okay on time? You have
Yes. I
15
was
more
I was
minutes?
checking whether somebody can stay longer with the girls. I have like 15 more minutes, maybe
Perfect.
20, and then I'll need to go back home. Yes.
Great. So let's go next to Ian.
Hello, folks. It's interesting that many of you found value in Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy. I presume when you talk about metaphysics, etc., you're talking about process and reality. And it's interesting to note that process and reality was driven by Whitehead trying to find some way of his son who died in the First World War to have some kind of life again. But Whitehead only had we would say Whitehead had a rather simple view in which there was a layer of possible and a layer of actual. But I think the idea of having multiple layers of reality is very important. And many of you have talked favorably about the virtual and actual distinction. Those are two layers. And also possible and actual. So I would suggest that you have multiple layers. You have possible, potential, and actual as three layers. And in quantum physics, we see this already. I mean, the wave function is a kind of possible and then potential. And so I think that I'm hopeful that science can get involved. And you ask about whether science can understand these things, it'll see them by their effects. And if we have a proper model, then we'll see the effects. And minds, I mean, Àlex has been talking about the effects of lots of things that are unusual. And so that it should be a way to understand. So I think it's important to allow multiple levels of reality, each with its own dimension, and not be afraid of splits or dualism or fragmentation, but all these levels have to be joined up causally in some way. And I think we have to have the courage to imagine multiple levels. I mean, I think of Emanuel Swedenborg, for example, has discrete degrees, which are very relevant in the situation. So I think that building on the Whitehead's initial impetus, we can generalize this to multiple levels, not just potential and actual as in process and reality, but other more general ones. So I think there's hope yet for understanding the things that Àlex has been talking about. I mean, we know, we see the evidence a lot. There's been evidence on all of these psychic and psi issues for hundreds of years or more. And so I think the question of theory is now coming to the forefront. And I'm a physicist as well. I want to know what the causes are, what the theories are. And I think these evidences can prompt us to think in new ways.
I would just add to this that the distinction between the virtual and the actual is so powerful to understand memory, which we hadn't talked about. So we've spoken about perception, but this question of where are memories stored, which again, I think it's an ill-posed question. We all take it for granted in neuroscience that it's of course somewhere in the brain, in the synapses and so on. Well, there's this fresh air when you realize that the virtual and the actual are not the same thing. Therefore, memories can be there virtually, and then you can access them, and so it's difficult. So again, I would insist that in philosophy, and I'm not following philosophy so closely today because I find it rather boring. I try to read the classics, but we need metaphysics and ontology, not just kind of vanilla kind of theories of mind. Yes. and all those sort of academic peacock show off that it's so shallow. And I'm saying this not being properly or officially a philosopher myself, right? But we really need you guys. We need people doing serious stuff, and we need to learn better our Heidegger, our Whitehead, and all the rest, our Schopenhauer, and not just the latest fashionable theory, because those conceptions of what can be real, it needs to be expanded much more beyond the point that Matt was rightly making, which is real is not equal to that which can be measured, of course, but maybe real is not equal and identical to that which is actual. And as you're saying, let's bring virtual and maybe let's bring more layers to it. And then our understanding of the world just becomes really enchanting, actually.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Carry on.
Yeah. And it just briefly, once we drop the materialist presupposition, which is, one way of trying to level everything out and explain it in terms of the simplest explanation possible, all on the same level. Once we move beyond a bifurcated conception of nature, we welcome consciousness back into the universe. and begin to do science again from an experiential starting point, like James or Bergson, then the door opens to these approaches that come from a more spiritualist orientation, whether it's theosophy or anthroposophy, and you get the idea of there's a physical, but there's also, say, an etheric and an astral and so on. And then we're off and running, and so many things, the explanatory avenues start to multiply very quickly. And we don't want to get carried away with that, but at the same time, yeah, Occam's razor, but as Whitehead said, seek simplicity, but distrust it. There's room for, I think it was McGilchrist actually who joked about Occam's beard. Let the beard proliferate. So, Kirsten, I see your hand up. You've been waiting patiently. Go ahead.
Hi. This is fantastic. I just love all of this. Thank you. I wanted to bring it down to one of the studies that you talked about, the sense of being stared at in that with the children in the lower socioeconomic class school. I've recently finished research in conjunction with Institute of Noetic Science that showed that adults who were abused or neglected as children have more precognitive skills, statistically significantly more precognitive skills. And I've tagged that to dissociation. So I don't like that word dissociation, but the ability to alter associate, to be imaginatively involved or absorbed in an alternate type of universe. I wondered about your idea, but is there a usefulness of measuring the commonalities of types of people who are better experiencers of this in order to work with people who are very, materialistic, and to say that this is coming from a certain place? I'd just love to hear your ideas regarding that.
And I'd love to hear more yours and your work on it, because I think there's something in it that's very tangible. Also, the role of emotion, and it's known as I read the literature that emotion plays a huge role in catalyzing these phenomena. And actually, in the lab, we usually try to get rid of those nuisances, right? It's noise, but I think it's what propels the signal. Now, let me give you an example with respect to scopaesthesia to make it concrete. Scopaesthesia is very related with the belief, let's say, on the evil eye, right? The idea that if you can be looked at, and for good, but for bad reasons. Now, as kids, depending where we grow, if we are an educated, European, whatever family, middle or high, in high economic status, well, the evil eye is, of course, a myth, and very soon you'll be kind of taken out of that belief if it ever occurs to you. But maybe in other socioeconomical situations, that's perfectly normal and accepted in the family, right? And I think that can change a lot the disposition that these kids may have, maybe unconsciously, about whether what's going to happen is possible or not, you see. And I was also very careful. It was an interesting learning exercise for me, how I even framed the whole activity. And it never occurred to me, especially because I've been working with fruit flies for a long time. It never occurred to me psychologists know that, but really how important it is how you prime the experience, the experiment in this case. So if I told them, okay, today we're gonna see whether this is possible or not, well, that's a horrible way of doing it, but I don't want to lie to them either, right? So we're seeing, we're playing, and so if I believe or not, how I express it, if they may take that as a possibility or not, and also the fact as well of, and I don't want to speculate a lot of that because I'll be rambling, not really knowing what I'm talking about, but the fact that they came from, that this in particular, that school that I revisited comes from an area which is known to be, well, not very well off and so on, was very salient, very remarkable. Like, is that a coincidence, or why are these kids more sensitive to that in a way? And well, I think I need to read your work and others to make sense, but it was like a detective game in a way. Okay, like this is a very salient statistic here. Let's go and figure it out. And that's where in a way, the data took us there. We didn't start with an idea that that's where we should go.
Yeah, like a lot of Sheldrake's work with precognition, the finches and the planarians is all related to safety. So it sort of tags that if you feel unsafe or if you're being stared at, it could create an unsafe feeling, which may allow you to tap into the sort of latent talents we all have.
Yes, and if I can speculate freely in terms of ontogeny here, development, well, if you're raised in a neighborhood where it's really important to have eyes on your back, right?
Yeah.
Well, maybe if there is that potential in human beings, it's going to be developed, otherwise you're going to have problems. So well, that can also be going on in that area.
Thank you.
All right, let's move on to Jay.
Yeah, thanks, Matt and Alex, for amazing conversation. And so I just wanted to just as a quick comment, I just wanted to bring attention to the notion of this notion called perceptual crossing, which has been studied which has received a lot of attention in like the inactivist and embodied cognition camp. And so it's the idea that like social perception, or any for that matter, is an inherently like interactive process. So this task is, so just to give like a quick overview of this experiment for those of you who are not familiar. So two people were controlling like their little avatars in the computer screen, and they only like so the task was people were instructed to press button whenever they thought that they crossed with each other, and the only sensory feedback that got was like a tactile like stimulation. And so there were like lots of distractors in the environment, and like either static or just regularly moving thing. But some people, I think it was like majority of people who were able to correctly describe whenever they crossed with another person that is like in the environment too, rather than the other distractors. So this has been, I also like played with this kind of modeling these dynamics using some kind of like computerized agents. And so the idea is that we should like move away from methodological individualism into more like relational view, where like the precision is like inherently interactive. So I thought this could be also very relevant to your studies in the scopaesthesia, because I kind of sense that it could also be very interactive process, because it implies that there are like two intentions. So one, people who receive some kind of precision might be also inherently more concerned about like if there are like others or people are watching, or more concerned about like their precision or self-conscious. So I was just reminded, because you also kind of drew parallels to people who were like more in a more disadvantaged positions, and they were like better at detecting if some people were like staring at them. So yeah, I think it's a good element to think about, that there should be like two intentions or attention that should meet in some realm, if that exists. And so yeah, just to give ideas if you're intending to like gamify in some kind of experiment setting.
Yes, thank you. I'll check those studies. I'm seeing some links in the chat. I cannot do it now, but I hope to get the chat and then be able to check those links. Yes, and I think the idea of conceiving not two people but a pair in analogy with quantum entanglement, I'm saying the same thing, but it can be very useful conceptually, that it's not this person and then that person and how it's happening. There's this whole, and things are going on in this whole, and then well, let's look at the parts, but starting with the whole, not trying to get at that, because otherwise it sounds like 6 impossible things before breakfast if you start like that.
Yeah, very interesting. I look forward to reading those papers. Thanks, Jay.
It
reminded me of this line from Charles Saunders Peirce, who says, when I communicate my thoughts and my sentiments to a friend with whom I am in full sympathy, so that my feelings pass into him and I am conscious of what he feels, do I not live in his brain as well as in my own, most literally? And so again, this is like an example of something we take for granted in our everyday interactions with one another. And it's almost a prerequisite for being, for communicating meaningfully, that we can inhabit one another's inner life and come to share that entanglement, if you will, perhaps by analogy, but maybe not. So there's definitely a helpful model here to pursue. So, all right, we're at the top of the hour here, so we should wrap up and let Àlex return to his family. I think it's quite a bit later in Spain there in the evening. So thanks so much, Àlex, and for everyone who chimed in to offer such helpful suggestions. I thought maybe something for Àlex to take back with him to the lab and tinker with.
Yes.
This was a great conversation and really just the beginning. I mean, there's so much more to explore here. So
yes, I feel it's the beginning of a conversation, and I want to thank you all. I felt really at home talking to you, and also to you, Matt. You must know I really admire what you're doing. I think you're an exponent in the philosophical world. I follow what you do very closely, and I'm really glad you're there pushing these ideas. And when I saw you in 2015, you looked like you were like a young promise, and you're still young, but this promise has become actual, not virtual. So thank you so much for what you do. And every time I have a question about Whitehead, sometimes I write to Rod, but sometimes I write to you, Matt, and you're always very willing to help us get through difficult passages. So hopefully we can continue working together behind the scenes and in front of the audience, figure these things out together.
I hope so, Àlex. Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.
All right.